Hi everyone. Do you guys enjoy Hacktivity? Yes? Can you please repeat this with more enthusiasm? Yes? All right, cool, awesome. So who am I? Turned out that I was presenting here at Hacktivity a lot, and I believe I am the guy who presented here the most. But if you guys don't know me, I'm mostly into offensive research when it comes to my free time. For example, I am the developer of the zombie browser toolkit. I'm the developer of the hardware firewall bypass toolkit. I created a malware analysis sandbox tool. I played with some crappy IoT devices, and my exploit ended up on 600,000 IP cameras via the Perserai botnet. I also invented the idea of encrypting the web-based exploits via Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and turned out that this was used by both the exploit kit developers from Russia and also some Chinese nation-state attackers. So my presentation is about Oldschool stuff, and you might ask, why am I interested in Oldschool things? And there is a great saying that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And during the presentation, you will see why I chose this motto. So let's start our journey in 1957. Who of you have heard about the guy Joy Bubbles? Okay, like 3 people, 4. So Joy Bubbles was one of the very first hackers on Earth, basically. And he was doing money at the university by selling long-distance calls for $1 only. And the way he was able to do that was because he hacked the phone system back in the days. All right, but how can you hack phone systems so early in the history? Basically, the way he created this hack was that first you have to call 800. We are talking about phone systems in the US. So first, you had to call this free but long-distance line, which starts with 800. Then you had to play this very famous 2600 hertz, which sounds like this. Can you guys hear it? No? Okay, so I will not use. I have an application on my phone which basically can simulate all these tones, but I will not use this in this case. And what this special sound does in these old phone systems, that it detects that the user basically hung up, and it stopped counting the minutes. So from now on, you don't have to pay for it. But because of this hack, you are still connected to the line. And if you just send the key pulse tone, then you send the new long-distance number and the start tone to the system, then you can get a free call. So basically, you hack the system, and you don't have to pay for calling long-distance lines. And why was this able? Why was this hack possible? In the past, after World War II, when people created the new phone system in the US, they wanted to save money. And they figured out that if they send the control signals and the voice signal on the very same channel, then they can basically save money on the equipment and all the things. And this is bad, because whenever someone can control both the data and the code, then hacks can happen. This is Joy Bubbles when he is doing his favorite hobby, calling people on the phone. This hack is called the blue box because later this whole hack was created in small hardware devices called the blue box. And as of today, there are still many ways how you can hack the phone system to create free calls. For example, when we are talking about the new VoIP systems, maybe you can find a VoIP system on the internet, check if it has any weak passwords, then there you go, you have free calls. Also, when it comes to the in-band signaling, we should not forget that basically all the Intel and ARM chips we use today, they also use the von Neumann architecture, where the code and the data is handled on the same line, which means that we have memory corruption exploits forever, basically. It would be nice to use the Harvard architecture, which doesn't have this issue, but due to many reasons, they were never popular in complex chips. All right, let's talk about the red boxes. We are in the 60s right now. Whenever you inserted your coins into a public payphone, the payphone generated a special tone and sent this special tone to the phone company system in the backend. And the backend started to count the minutes based on the money you inserted into the payphone. So basically what you can do is whenever you insert the money into your payphone, you just record the sound which is sent to the backend, and if you replay it, you can fool the backend that you inserted more money into the payphone. As I mentioned, there are multiple apps on both Google Play Store and iOS, which you can use to generate these special tones. Also, if you are really interested in these very old multi-frequency phone hacking, there is a project called projectmf.org, which is hosted in the US, and you can basically dial to them and play all these blue box, red box, and other similar hacks on their simulated system. And they also provide the schematics to you. So if you really, really want to do this at home, you can build it in your home. It's also important to note that back in the days, the police thought that this is really serious hack. So whenever they found someone with a red box or a blue box in their pocket, they got arrested and they were sent to prison due to fraud. How many of you guys know the movie Hackers? Awesome, cool. So basically, the guy we saw on this screenshot from the movie Hackers was doing the exact same hack. And this is how it really happened in the past. Now, if you think about what kind of vulnerabilities exist today, which are similar to this red box hacking, you can think about, for example, mobile applications, which are thick client applications, where the client stores the money you have in your wallet, and the client will send this money to the server. And you would think, who would do that, right? That's just pretty stupid architecture. And turns out, this is a real SQLite database from a real vending machine application. So basically, the SQLite database stored locally on your phone was storing all the credits you have topped up. So you just had to basically root your Android device, find this SQLite file, change the corresponding columns, and you get free chocolate or Coke from the vending machine. Now, this is a very interesting hack called one-call restriction. The story is that this hack was again invented by Joy Bubbles when he was 7 years old. And the story goes like that he had a very mean babysitter, and the babysitter didn't really like that Joy Bubbles was playing a lot with the phone. So this babysitter basically locked the rotary dial on the phone. But Joy Bubbles was really consistent that he really wanted to use the phone. So he figured out that if he taps on the switch hook in the same pattern as the signals are sent to the phone system, then he can basically dial the phone numbers he wants to. And for example, it's very hard to tap very long phone numbers, but luckily there are short numbers which you can use to get a nice lady, and you can tell the nice lady that please call me this number, which is a long number. So you can tap the short numbers and get a call. Again, hackers. This guy was arrested, and he only had the right to call his lawyer. But after the rotary dial was locked, he was able to tap a phone number and call anyone, basically. I believe this one-call restriction is again very similar to a weak form of client-side security checks. For example, if you try to validate in a web application the HTTP parameters on the client side. For example, once I tested a web application, and when I entered the famous apostrophe character for SQLite injection exploit into one of the fields, it was actually the login form, then I got back an instant JavaScript alert that this character is forbidden. So I instantly checked what can I do if I don't use JavaScript. I turn it off. Can I send this character to the server? Turned out I can, and turned out the server side was not checking these special characters. They were not using any kind of protection against SQL injection, so I was able to execute any kind of SQL query on the database. But the developers really thought that they have protected against this vulnerability, because on the user interface, you are not allowed to input any apostrophe. When it comes to phone phreaking, we also have to mention Captain Crunch. And he was really famous that he really liked to phone by basically anonymizing his phone call by using hops between these wide area telephone services. And this is basically the very first Tor network, if you think about this way. And once he had an interview, and he basically called himself through multiple hops, and he was able to receive his call on his other phone. And when he said hello in one of the phones, it took like 15 seconds to hear it back on the other part of the phone, because he routed his phone call through the whole earth. And if you are into the Sneakers movie, you have seen the very same technique used in that movie. But as far as I know, at that time, this hack didn't really work anymore, and it was able to trace back these calls easily. Besides all of these blue box and red box and other hacking methods, there was another very interesting way how hackers could gain free long-distance calls in the US. Back in the days, there were some very small phone companies who didn't have any budget or infrastructure to build their own backends. So they were using the backend phone systems of the big companies like AT&T. And by default, what you had to do is that you went to a local shop, you bought something called calling card number, which had a 6-digit PIN code, basically. And after that, what you had to do is you called a local number, which was basically operated by this small phone company. Then you entered your calling card number. Then after that, you entered the long-distance area code you wanted to call and the phone number. This was popular back in the days because using this system was cheaper than using the long-distance calls of the big companies. But hackers quickly figured out that because these PIN codes are pretty short, like 6 digits, and many people use these calling card numbers, it is really easy to brute force these PIN codes. And after you have the PIN code, you can basically call long-distance calls, and someone else will pay for it. Back in the day, it was not very trivial how you can automate this attack, but people quickly figured out that if they are using modems and BBS systems, they can quickly automate this whole hack. It was also interesting that this fraud was really hard to detect because the logs were recorded and stored at the big telco companies, and they were not really interested in investigating frauds for these small phone companies. Another interesting way to have free phone calls was something called these test pair loop numbers. You have to imagine that you call a special phone number, and if someone else calls another phone number which is next to the first one, in the phone system, they are connected, looped together, and this is basically for testing debugging purposes, but that you don't have to pay anything. So if you basically just distribute these phone numbers around your friends, and they call these numbers, you get basically free chat roulette. And these were pretty interesting back in the days when there was no internet at all, but people really wanted to communicate with each other. Now, how many of you guys ever used a bulletin board system? Hands up. All right, that's pretty cool. I have to admit that the first time when I used a BBS system was like 3 years ago, and at the beginning I really didn't understand what is going on. Then I realized that these bulletin board systems are really great at doing one thing, because basically how you have to imagine a bulletin board system is that, let's say that you have a web server, but with only one network socket. So only one client can connect to your web server at a time. And back in the days, BBSs were not operated over internet, TCP/IP. You could connect to a BBS system via the phone line. And again, this is why it was very important for the hackers to hack free long-distance calls, because this way they were able to dial into these BBS systems for free. Again, back in the days, modems were not really fast, so you can count with 300 bit per second modems. So everything was text-based. People did not really had any HD movies to share. Luckily, BBS systems are still well and alive. You can find a lot of BBS systems on the internet. So I went on and I have registered myself to one of these BBS systems in Houston, Texas. This is running on a TI-99. I can get back some information from my last login. And we are greeted with the main screen of the BBS system. I really love these graphics. I mean, they are so beautiful. I can list who connected to the system recently. I can check what the system administrator posted, everyone to read. I can check all the BBS systems this BBS system knows about. Here you can see, for example, some which are running on Commodore or running DOS operating system. And last but not least, you can play games online. But I really have to admit that playing these games via BBS systems is a bit stupid, because all of these games are really old, and you don't really need any kind of network connectivity to play these games. You can just play these offline. But because you can, and why not, you can play these very old text-based adventure games through BBS systems. Luckily, I was using my internet connection to do that, so I don't have to pay for long-distance calls to call to the US to play this one. But anyway. All right, let's move on. And let's see how you can hack BBS systems. One very popular way back in the days was that you created your own backdoor. Then you created a zip file, and you hex edited your zip file and replaced the file name to ./bbs.exe. And then you uploaded your zip file to the bulletin board system, because they acted as a file exchange server. Now what happens that the bulletin board system will extract all the files, and it will basically overwrite the files one directory ahead. So whenever that executable is running again, it will run your code. And this is how you can basically backdoor, for example, BBS systems. During some weekends, I had some free time, and I wanted to create a demo video on how you can do this hack. But unfortunately, I was not very lucky with this experiment. But while I was investigating this whole vulnerability, I found that one very popular BBS system, which was open source in the past 20 or 30 years, had a serious vulnerability. It had a bad file name function, and as you can see in the diff patch, whenever they listed these bad file names, they forgot to put commas between the file names. And if you really know how C works, if you compile this program, C will just concatenate all of these names. So basically, these names didn't really appear in the final binary file. So I created, this whole project is on GitHub, so I created a pull request, and they accepted it. But I think this is, again, a very good example of open source. I believe this vulnerability was there for 20 years or so. So it is pretty fun to find such vulnerabilities in open source code. If you remember, this hack was talking about about manipulating the zip file to have a // file name. And last year, some researchers found that this exploitation exists, and they were really, really excited about this. But this is a modified version of their announcement, because originally they thought that they have invented something really, really new. But other people told them, yeah, we used this technique to hack BBS systems like 30 years ago, so this is not really new what you invented. Usenet. How many of you guys have read any message on a Usenet? All right, and how many of you guys posted to Usenet? Okay, awesome. Usenet was basically the very first forum-like functionality forum-like application where you could subscribe to different groups. And if you look at the architecture, how Usenet servers work, they are not really modern, scalable, peer-to-peer. These are basically big servers which are syncing all the content between each other. So let's say you have a Usenet server in Japan, in US, in Africa, and they have all the same content, and they are constantly synchronizing the content between each other. And if you have access to one of these Usenet servers, then you can subscribe to one of the groups and get the messages from there or to post to this group. When the whole Usenet idea was born, not many people used the internet, so there was basically no administration or filtering or any other mechanism built into Usenet, which meant it quickly became a source of headache that people just spammed the Usenet servers. Especially in the US, when a lot of people got the AOL connection and they found out that internet exists, then that was the time when the quality of the Usenet group started to decline. It's interesting to see that even though in the beginning Usenet was architectured for text-based messages, people quickly figured out that you can split your binaries, convert it to some ASCII characters, and post it on Usenet. And this is how Varese started on Usenet. It was like 5 or even 10 years ago when Napster was not popular anymore because it was shut down, and but torrent started to gain attraction. And back in that day, there was a really vibrating Varese scene on the Usenet servers. But there was one rule of this Varese scene, that you don't talk about Usenet, because they thought that if not too many people know that you can do Varese on Usenet, then they can evade these copyright laws. This worked for a little bit, but at the end of the day, people found out that people are doing Varese on Usenet. So this year, I have subscribed myself to one of these Usenet servers. Actually, you have to pay money to access these Usenet servers. Some offer free trial, but with the free trial, you cannot post messages to Usenet servers, unfortunately. So, because I wanted to post a message, I subscribed and I paid real money to use the Usenet servers. Here you can see one of the messages I posted to Usenet. And yeah, as you can see, there are tons of different groups on Usenet where you can find old information. One issue with Usenet is the so-called retention policy, which means that almost all servers delete old content from the Usenet servers. And if you really want to look at old Usenet messages, you have to check places like archive.org or similar places. But they are there, and it's fascinating. All right, let's talk about the Morris worm. The Morris worm was developed by a guy in a university called Robert Morris. And this is his CV, and I really, really love this part in his CV, that in 1988, his discovery of buffer overflow first brought the internet to the attention of the general public. That's one way to say that, yeah, I wrote the first network worm, and the internet was broken after I released it. When it comes to Morris worm, the source code of it is published on GitHub. So I found that it would be really, really great if I can just download it, find an emulator which I can use to run this Morris worm code. I copy my source code into the operating system, I compile it, run it, and let's do a Wireshark capture between the different systems, and let's see how my worm will infect my other old BSD machines. Turned out this is not that easy, because if you look at the source code which was posted on GitHub, you can see that some pretty important functions are not implemented at all. I did spend more time to figure out what is going on here than I can tell you, because I'm quite embarrassed how much time I did spend on it, but I couldn't figure really out what I should do here. So this is what I can provide to you instead of the demo. But luckily this year I found another guy who was really interested in recreating the Morris worm. So I have his contacts, so probably we can team up and start the Morris worm again. I'm pretty sure that almost all of you guys heard about the NotPetya ransomware from 2 years ago. And I found it very fascinating that a lot of the functionalities between the Morris worm and the NotPetya worm is the same. The only difference is that 13 years has passed between the two. Both scans the network for new victims. Both exploits memory corruption vulnerabilities to spread. Both exploits password reuse vulnerabilities to spread. The Morris worm really broke the internet, caused panic. NotPetya partially broke the internet. The only difference is that back in the day, internet was really small. But when it comes to calculating the damages, NotPetya is probably in a bigger amount of money. For both worms, there is a vaccine available to prevent infection. When it comes to the Morris worm, it runs just fine without admin privileges, but the NotPetya needed the Mimikatz module. This is not written anywhere, but it's really interesting to see that when this Morris worm was released, there was basically zero paper on the internet how you can write buffer overflows. Zero. It took, I'm not sure, like 5 years after the Morris worm when Aleph 1 published his paper about smashing the stack. But the father of Robert Morris was working for the NSA at the time when Robert Morris released his code exploiting the fingerD daemon via memory corruption exploits and buffer overflows. So I believe that this is hell a lot of a coincidence. But when it comes to NotPetya, we know that they used leaked code from the NSA. The only huge difference between the two codes is that the Morris worm was coded by a single university student, and NotPetya was coded by a huge APT threat actor. It might be a university student, but we don't know that. Also, on the right, you can see the NotPetya screen, and on the left, a very, very old ransomware called AIDS ransomware. So again, I find it really fascinating that the NotPetya developers were using the same design choices what was used back in the old days. All right, let's talk about Gopher. How many of you guys visited a Gopher site ever? Awesome, awesome. Probably, if I have internet, I can show it to you how it looks like. Cool. So basically, How you have to imagine a Gopher site is that you just have a text file in the beginning, you have directories, and you have files. And basically that's it. You can go into directories and read the files. That's it. So this is what was popular before the World Wide Web. Windows 95. Have more fun. From its friendly, intuitive interface to its speedy performance, Windows 95 is the best. So in the next couple of minutes, I will talk about hacking Windows 95 and how you can do that. You might ask, how in the hell did I start to hack Windows 95? And there is a fun story around this. I was playing at a CTF event, and turned out that one of the machines we had to hack was a Windows 95 machine, and no one was able to hack it during that competition. So I went home and I created my lab environment, and I tried to figure out how you can hack it. My goal was that I have to use existing tools for the hack, because during a CTF there is really, during that kind of CTF we were playing, there is not time to create your own tools or find your own exploits. I have to achieve remote code execution with my hack, but there is no user interaction on the Windows 95 side. I wanted to set up everything as default as possible. But turns out that when you install Windows 95, there is no networking configured at all, so it's impossible to hack it. So I had to configure networking, and by default, there is no port opened on the Windows 95, so I had to create a service in order to open a port. So I just created a writable C share on the Windows 95. And there is this really fun vulnerability, which was exploited by a network worm later. And the way this exploit works is that the Windows 95 server checks the length of the password based on what the client sends to it. So if you send that, all right, my password is has a 0 length, it will say, oh, I checked your 0 length password with my store password and it matches on the 0 length, so you are in. But if you send a length of 1, then you can basically try to figure out the first letter of the password very easily. You just have to try the ASCII letters, then you can go on to the next one, and you get this real Hollywood-style hack, how you can get the password. I found this very old tool to basically do this hack, but it's not very modern, and I couldn't really use it on my operating systems I'm using nowadays. If you look at the Wireshark Capture, this is the capture where you can see that it already figured out that the password starts with a pass. Then it checks the W, and it gets a different answer. So now it knows that the password starts with pass W. Then it starts the other letters. So here we can see this in action. And because I was not satisfied with the GUI tool, I re-implemented it in Metasploit, and I will publish it after the presentation. So here we can see there is a huge delay put into the script. So by default, it can figure out the password in like 2 seconds or even less, but that wouldn't be very nice to show you during this demo. So this is where you can see that it tries to figure out the password. And it will see that, okay, next letter was O, so I can go on and see all the others. Yeah, and it checks all the shares it can find. So nothing really exciting here. And last but not least, how many of you guys have heard about the hacking tool called Fluxi? All right, I'm really happy to show something which was never heard by anyone. This was a Chinese graphical user interface hacking tool, and it was published in 2002. And if you check at all the functionality it provides, this is just really amazing. It was like Metasploit web GUI on steroids, but years and years later. So thank you guys for your attention. That's all I really wanted to share with you. And if you want to contact me, you can find me on Twitter, or you can find me on my website, https://www.zoltanbalazs.com.com. That's really my website. And so thank you for your attention.